Morning, everyone, and welcome back to another lecture for web and mobile systems. So we will continue our discussions regarding the different aspects of the React JS library. What we had done specifically in the previous class is basically to discuss about a feature in the React JS library that is known as props. Okay, so essentially, what props helps us achieve is to make the React JS code basically reusable. Okay, so essentially, the way it does it is when we develop any kind of section or subsection within our UI using React JS, we kind of develop that as functional components, okay, using the JSX syntax that React JS library uses in order to develop our front end components, right? So essentially, the meaning behind having functional components is in the form of saying something along the lines of the fact that all of our different sections, subsections that we may have on our front end system are basically defined and treated as a function. So when we think of regular functions in our traditional programming constructs and stuff like that, so when we define a function, that function typically has some sort of a return type, okay, followed by the name of the function. So we can just say something along the lines of fn name, and then signifying using these first brackets, essentially meaning that this label is basically a function and not some plain old variable. And within the first brackets, we can essentially kind of declare different parameters that will be accepted by the function, right? And then it will be used for some sort of processing within our function body, right? So within these curly braces, which signifies the function body, we have the logic, and the logic essentially kind of consumes the parameters that are essentially declared for our function, right? And this is the declaration part. And when we kind of execute this function in the traditional programming language, all we do is basically we call the name of the function. And then within the first brackets, we provide what we call as the arguments of the function. So essentially, depending on how you declare or how you kind of implement the function, there are two different ways, depending on the language, of course. Some languages don't support the second way, but some languages essentially do provide support for that second way. And what I'm referring to is whether you are defining a function to execute as call by value, or whether you are designing the function to be executed as call by reference, right? So if you do not remember this is kind of a direct callback to learning the basics of programming. Okay, so that is not relevant here, so to speak, because regardless of however you do it, essentially what happens is the arguments that is passed when you call the function is sent to the parameters. It's either a new copy of the arguments is created in the parameters, or the parameters are basically pointing to the arguments wherever the actual values of the arguments are stored, which is the essential distinction between call by value and call by reference. But the matter of the fact is, these parameters, when they receive the values of these arguments, then within the body of the function that you have defined, you can essentially perform all these processings, right? So this idea or this logic is what defines the utility of props within React.js, because all of your different UI subsections or different components in your pages will be defined as functional components. So to initially understand the implementation of React.js props, we were just talking about this very plain, simple example where we had basically a portfolio website design, right? A skeletal structure. And then it had all of these different functional components. And to remember, every functional component's name will start with a capital letter. And then the name of the function within the functional component will be the same as that of the file name that you provide, right? And then it will have a return statement similar to how we do have it in the traditional programming construct as well. It will have some sort of return statement. And that return statement basically in this scenario, in the scenario of React.js, will consist of the body of the different contents that you would like to render on the web browser. Okay, so it will be basically created as a React DOM, and then using third-party transpilers like Babel or Webpack, it will be translated to the actual DOM structure that we kind of learned when we worked with, plain HTML or plain JavaScript, right? So in this structure, if you have a scenario, which you will certainly have when you're developing practical web interfaces or even mobile interfaces, so to speak, is the fact that you might have a situation when you would need to kind of call or execute a certain functional component of your web design or of your web interface multiple times. So the example that we had here was this particular portfolio example. This would have a project's functional component, and the project's functional component will have certain content that will be repeated across different projects that you would want to specify on your web interface, right? So what that means is that you might have a title, you might have a job description, start date, location, description. So these are the content that will be repeated across all the different projects, but the actual content will vary, right? So in a traditional way of designing this particular scenario, if you would have to kind of code this out, then in plain HTML, you would have to take this content here. So basically you have a div wrapper, and then you have all the different contents using different HTML aspects, right? HTML elements that is available depending on how you want to style it. And you would have to serially, that is one after the other, you would have to keep on writing all of these different contents. So your code base becomes very big, right? So instead of doing that, what we can do is we can design this particular functional components, which is supposed to display the contents of each and every project in the form of a React JS prop. So what happens is this is the definition of it. So now if we start drawing comparisons to how we wrote it here, right? So it doesn't have a return type per se, okay? Because the JavaScript, when you're just using JavaScript, as long as you're not using TypeScript, then we don't have to worry much about the data type as such, right? It works a little bit similar to Python, that whatever you assign to the variable, that variable becomes that data type depending on what value you're assigning, right? So JavaScript is also similar, but if you want to change that aspect, you have to, instead of using or developing using JavaScript, you have to move on to TypeScript, which is a more stricter environment in contrast to JavaScript itself. And that gives you the ability to specify data types, to specify return types, and those kind of things, right? If you are more comfortable with that kind of developmental scenario. So we don't have any return type here, right, per se, but then we have the name of the functional component, which is going to be the same as the name of the file that you're declaring it. And within the first brackets is where you can specify the parameters. So the parameters are specified using the keyword props itself. That is just a naming convention. You can have anything that you like. You can even have the individual key values that you're going to be passing. You can have the name of the keys that you're going to be sending out or sending into this particular functional component, right? But what we generally do is we kind of wrap it up completely within an object, and we call that object as props itself, right? So if you're trying to access any particular key of that particular object, we can use the object name and then the dot operator followed by the key, or we can simply destructure the object and then extract the individual key names and then use the key names later on within our JSX component, right? So this is how we declare it, right? And then the logic consumes the parameter. So here we can see that if anywhere we want to replace the content that is repeating, but is unique for every repetition or every iteration, then what we are doing is we are wrapping that piece of code within curly braces. So again, if you recall, any piece of code which is within this return statement body is JSX syntax. So if you want to perform JavaScript-based operation, for example, here what we are essentially trying to do is kind of do an assignment operation. What we are doing is we are replacing this content, which actually has some sort of value, with the actual value when it will be rendered on the web page itself, right? So This is also the way when you connect with your backend and your backend is sending some sort of data to your front end, either by reading that information from a database or stuff like that. You use essentially the same syntax in order to kind of get that data to be rendered on your interface itself, right? So here, when I kind of wrap it around these curly braces, this operation here is no longer a JSX syntax. It is basically a JavaScript operation, which is to just call on the actual data that is stored inside props.title, right? So this is an object, and this is a key member of the object, and this key will be mapped to a value, right, which will be sent when the function is being called. So this is how you set up the declaration and basically the processing of the function body, right, or the processing of the functional component. And then wherever you need to render this, so on your project hierarchy or on your interfaces hierarchy, you would be kind of specifying the execution of these different functional components one by one, right? In a way that you would want to display that on the web page itself. So here, for example, the way we have set it up, and we do that in the app.js, which is the main page of the application logic itself. And then that app.js is fed into the landing page of our React JS, which is index.js. So here we call the navbar, which is some functional component, and this is the syntax for the call of your functional component. We don't use the name of the function or the way we do it in traditional programming languages. It's a little bit different from that. Essentially, what we do is we use these angular brackets with a self-closing tag, and we just provide the name of the function. And granted, one thing that you have to remember is before you can do this functional component call, you essentially have to import the file. And provided that you already have an export statement within that particular file, you have to bring that into an object here, and then you can make a call to that function component. So coming back to the props part of it, which is this execution part from traditional programming language. So what you do is when you call that function, you specify the name of the argument that you're going to be passing into the functional component, and then assign the value that you're trying to assign, or you can hard code it as a literal value if you would want to do that. But anyways, at the end of the day, you have to remember any kind of JavaScript operation must be enclosed within these curly brackets if you are specifying that within this return state, right? So this return statement, any code that is present here is basically the JSX code, which will be rendered on the web page, right? It's a part of the React DOM itself. So here, what you can do essentially, if you have multiple different components. So for example, in addition to title, let's say if the next component was the role, right? So if I create something along the lines of, where it go? If I create one more key value pair here, and if I say something along the lines of role, and the role was that of, let's say, project manager. So if you want to add more components or more props to this particular functional call, then you just separate it, and then you can simply say role. So that will become the name of your prop. So that means the next time that you are trying to access it within the body of the functional component, then you would be writing props.role. So whatever name you give, that becomes a part, or that becomes a member of the props object when it is received there, right? So here you can simply just take project one, and then dot. You have role here, so it will just capture it since it is being stored as an object. So now, essentially, what happens is that if you need to use this value within the body of the functional component, then you will replace this title that is here with the same way that we did for the previous one, that we will enclose it in the curly braces because we want to perform a JavaScript operation. We will essentially do props dot, and then we know for a fact that our second object or the second key value pair is essentially role. So this way you can kind of transform the entire functional body into something that is more generic in nature. And anytime that you want to change the actual content, all you do is when you are calling that function, wherever it is that you're calling that function, you essentially pass all of these different arguments that will be received by the props object, and then you can break it down one by one and you can work on that, right? So that is the whole idea of props, and it kind of simplifies our code base to a very large extent. And I wouldn't say it automates the process, but there is a way you can automate the process is if you can kind of wrap this function call. Because if you think about it, right now we are just working with a toy example, which shows here it has just 2 arguments, right? But if you look at these net extent of what we have to give a prop for our start date, start year, whatever you want to call it. We want to give a prop for our end year. That is going to be different. Location, that is different. So we already have what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 different props. So essentially what I want you all to imagine is that just with 6 different props, this function call is going to have 6 different input arguments, right? So it's going to expand a lot. So imagine this is 6 and the 6 becomes 12. There is a chance that it may happen, right? You don't know for sure. So this can keep on growing one after the other. The other problem that you have, if you have something like this, that is if you're doing a hard-coded call to your different functional component by using props, maybe you want to describe, let's say, 10 different projects. So what ends up happening is that I have to make this call, which you see here in line 25 and 26. I have to repeat this 10 times, right? So if I do it manually, I would end up having something like, oh, this project call is taking place 10 different times, right? So then the place where you're calling the props or basically calling the functional components with React props, that becomes a little bit messy and hard to kind of keep a track of. So we have to be not just efficient with respect to how we design the functional component itself, but we need to be a little bit more efficient about where and how we are calling the actual functional component with the props as well. So as we discussed last time, a way to solve this is that generally, right now, since we are working in the absence of a backend, so we wouldn't have any kind of API calls to receive the data from our backend server or wherever the data, the read operation is going to happen in the backend from a database, and it's going to send the data package to the front end server, because this is a front end server that is run, right? So you cannot get that. But at the end of the day, if you did have something like that, what you can do is you can store all of them in an array of objects, right? So here you can see that there is one object that is storing the value of project 2, one object we have storing the value of project 1. So what we can do is, like, if we have 10 projects, we can create an array of objects instead of having these individual objects floating around. And then we can write a for loop in that object. And then we can make a single functional component call, which is a body of a for loop. And then in each iteration of the for loop, we extract one of the indexes in a sequential fashion. And that index will be basically the object which consists of all the different unique information. And then we can kind of design our functional component call in such a way that in every iteration, we are basically plugging in the value of the appropriate index, which kind of points to a particular object. And that is essentially one data set into the functional component call. And that kind of simplifies the process altogether, right? So with that discussion in mind, I'm going to move on to the implementation of a little bit more practical clone. Okay, and what I wanted to show you is the same thing again, but in a more cleaned up fashion, okay, rather than having it be around here and there. So we are going to work on the clone of Airbnb online experiences that we talked about before, right? So essentially, if we search for online experiences, let me just run this first. Okay, so we are right now in React demo. So we will clean this up, ls this, and then we are inside demo 2. So cd into demo 2, and then cd into my app. Okay, and then essentially, if we need to start the server, then we execute the command of npm start, which is a script, which will essentially start this React scripts dash server. Okay, and then wait for it to finish its operation. Okay, so essentially what we have here is basically this is what we are working with. And you can see that this development is so quick at this point of time that all it remains for us to do is just add some practical CSS aspect to it, and your project is essentially more or less ready, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time fixing this. So what we are going to do is we're going to revamp the code base that we already have to create something which is Airbnb online experiences. Okay, so this is what we want to work on. Right, so not exactly this, but something similar to this. So we are just going to clone this. So have something like this. So you can see here, similar to the projects example that we were talking about, here they have these experiences that is kind of repeating from one set to another set. And then each of these different experiences card, we call these card components in technical terms, they have a repeating pattern. That is an image, a rating, maybe a star symbol, how many people have reviewed this, where the location is, what is the title, and how much is the price, right? So if you compare this, you can see that this is a repetitive content, and this is repeating across all of the different sections or subsections that we have here. So we don't write this multiple times. What we are going to do is we're going to create a single functional component for a single card, and we're going to call it a card component. And then we're going to save the data of different online experiences for Airbnb to, let's say, a particular file. Okay, so here you can see that I had created these individual objects here in order to store the data. So we are not going to have the data store here, our temporary data store, our local data store. We are going to create a separate file altogether for it. And in that file, we are going to create an array of objects, right? And we're going to export that array of objects and then use it in the app.js file, essentially, in order to work with our Airbnb clone, right? So we need to clean up this project directory a little bit in order to make space for our Airbnb clone. So I'm going to delete some of the existing applications or files that we already have. So I'm going to clear out this components directory. So if you want to work with me, what you can do is you can either keep this file if you want to work with this project directory. If not, if you want to start with a fresh canvas on your side, then you can essentially just do npx create React app and then give a name such as Airbnb clone, right? And then once this is done, you will cd into the Airbnb clone that you have created, and then just do npm start. All right, and make sure to clean out all the boiler template files. That is, we talked about the fact that when you run this command here, it generates a lot of like hello world type of files, associated files within the public directory and within the source directory. And that is not necessary for what we are doing. So essentially, you have to clean up that project directory as well, right? So you can either choose to go that route, or you can either choose to do what I'm doing here. You basically can make a copy of this folder from wherever this folder is saved, and you can put it somewhere else, and then you can clean up this folder, right? So what I'm going to do to clean up this folder is just delete all of these guys, and this will break my essentially my server, because I'm removing all of my stuff, but that is absolutely fine. Okay, so too much errors, we can just ignore it for the time being. We can leave the public folder as is. We don't have to make any changes to the public folder. So I'm just going to minimize that public folder. I have added an images folder here, and I have got this images from my own GitHub repository that I'm going to be using across various areas of the code itself. So you can go to my GitHub repository as well. And the name of the project is basically Airbnb-React clone. From there, you can grab, you can go into the SRC folder. And in the SRC folder, you will find this images directory, and you can grab all those images, or you can put your own images, whatever it is that you wish to do, okay? App.css, we're going to leave it as such. Index.js, we're going to leave it as such as well. The only thing that we need to change here is we need to clean up this app.js. So we don't need any of these imports because these files don't exist anymore. We are going to create a separate location for storing the data that needs to be rendered on the website or on the web application. So I'm going to remove this here as well. And then this we have to change a little bit, but we will come back to this whenever we are ready to work with it, right? So the first thing that I would like to do is set up the data itself, right? The data that we are going to be working with. So I'm going to set that up. So the data that I will create will be within the SRC component as well. So I'm going to create it in the root folder of SRC, right? So click on the root folder, create a new file, and let us call it carddata.js, right? So again, what card means for those who are still trying to get their head around is basically these components that you see, and these are like quite similar in terms of design if you go to different websites as well, right? If you take this to a lifestyle website, to an e-commerce website, or a blog post website, you will see card components across all of the design criteria that are being implemented, right? So when we say anything called a card, basically what we are referring to is a structure like this, which has a repetitive content that you're going to be displaying on your web systems, right? Or even your mobile systems, by the way. Keep that in mind, that the coding context or the structures that the constructs that you use is going to be a little different in the mobile development, but the logic is going to remain the same as to how you're going to populate all of these different contents. So keep that in mind, right? So working with the card data, all we need to do is import a bunch of images here and then create the content itself, right? So I'm going to start with creating an array, because we're going to create an array of objects. So here we will say array of objects that will store the card data, okay, for our clone application. So we are just going to call the data array as data itself, and for array we will have these third brackets, and once this third bracket is done, essentially for each of the members items of the array, we are going to have an object. So for object we have the curly braces, and then within the curly braces we start specifying the key value pair. So of course we will need some sort of an ID. So here I don't have a database, which is not generating a unique ID for me. I'm not using the UUID package that is also there, which can be used to generate unique universal IDs for all of our different components. I'm just going to give a toy ID. Let's call it 1, but you need to. So also what we need is like the title of the Airbnb experiences. So let's say this is the experience that I'm going to be sharing. So this is from Airbnb website itself for Detroit. So we are going to say Detroit murals on e-bike, which is there. So you can check it out from the Airbnb online experiences for Detroit. That will show you. It also has a description along with all of the different contents that we talked about. And the description, we can give some value here. And I'm just going to be using the content from Airbnb itself. So watch Detroit mural on e-bikes, something just the same, right? Without going into too much complexities. And then as we saw here, so we have the title, and then we have some price, and then we have the location, we have the rating, and we have how many number of people have reviewed that particular online experience, right? So we're going to fill up the rest of the information that we need to fill up the card data for an individual object. So we already have the title, the description. ID is something that we need on our side with respect to the development. So I'm going to go ahead and fill out the price. Just going to give some random values here. And then we have the image, right? So we need to have the cover image of this online experiences. So here, this is more like a media file that is there, which is kind of showing a carousel of images that is taking place. So for us, we're going to keep it simple, and we are just going to give a singular image that is there, right? So for the cover image, we have to basically bring the image, first import the actual media file, wherever that path is, into this particular file. And then we are going to use the object that is going to store the file path, right? So for us, the image that we are going to be using is this one here, which says Detroit murals.jpg, right? So I need to first import my images. So here I'm going to give a little bit more space and say import all relevant files. Right. So the import statement simply starts with an import and then the object that is going to store the import. So I'm just going to say something like Detroit murals. Okay, you can say Detroit murals image, whatever it is that you want to put. Then we have a from, which is a part of the syntax. And then within the quotes, we need to specify the exact path of where this image is, right? So now if we check here, we are right now in the root directory of this whole project, right? So if I minimize this, we can see that this whole thing is in the root directory. Okay, so what we are going to do is from the root directory, go to the subfolder for images and then grab the file detroitmurals.jpg, right? So from the root directory, go to the subfolder called images, and within that, grab the file called detroit-murals.jpg. Okay, that's the file that we are working with. So we grab that and then we are going to take that object, which stores the path, and then we are simply just going to put that object as a call to the directory here in our object store, right? So once that is done, we are going to put the next item, which we can call as the stats. So the stats itself will be a nested object, okay, and not a simple key value pair. So we're going to create a nested object here, and the sub members or the child members of the stats will be, let's say we will have some sort of a rating. We can give it some rating, give it the best rating possible. And then we also need to kind of specify how many people have reviewed that particular experiences. So we can give some value here. The value itself doesn't matter. And then what remains is basically the location where it is taking place. So the location is basically for us, it is Detroit. And then this is going to be a string. So we're going to wrap this string up. And then finally, what we have is maybe we can put this for later purposes, that how many open spots are available if you're trying to book something. So we will just keep it for now. Maybe we will use it for a later date whenever we are done with the initial design process. So this is how an individual data object is going to look like for our particular Airbnb clone website, right? So we will have 2 or 3 such data objects and stuff like that, right? So we are going to repeat this process 2 more times. So I'm not going to, write out the entirety of this data object. I'm going to do some copy pasting operation here. So the other 2 data slots that we have is basically these emerging artists of Detroit, and then chat with my cat if you want to do that. And then we need to bring the import statements for the other 2 images that we worked with. So here, I'm just going to copy paste the same thing here. And then we are going to finish this whole process where we have 3 objects. Each of them have their own unique ID, and all of the different content, just like we did for the projects example in the previous example, right? So we just created the same thing, right? And here we just have some random values here just to kind of fill up the content with respect to what we are working with, right? So now, once the data is ready, now we have to think in terms of the design of, how we are going to work or how we are going to set up this application. Remember, we did the same thing with our portfolio website where we thought of like, okay, what components are going to be there in our web design? And then we kind of worked from there with respect to how we are going to be showing those different components. So the way that I want to design this particular website or this clone of the website is pretty similar to what we do, right? So if you think of this as our initial canvas, please just bear with my great diagrams here. So if this is the browser window that you're working with, the way I want to create this website is basically I will have a component here, which is going to be my navbar component. Okay. And after my navbar component, I will have a landing card or a landing component here, which we technically call as a hero component. So essentially the hero component gives an explanation of what this page is about, right? What is going to be the main content of this page? What can you expect from this page? So anytime when you're developing this interface where you have to give the users or your clients a quick idea of what they're dealing with, we basically place those content top center, right? So that, okay, the page loads, and then that is the exact thing that your users are going to see, and they understand what they're dealing with. So you can, in a way, say it is like a summary of the entire page, kind of highlighting the main components, or not highlighting the main components, but kind of conveying the main purpose of this page, right? So those contents are known as hero contents, right? So that is what it comes front and center to you. And the way you design it is with the help of a hero component, because remember, in React JS, every different sections of your page is going to be treated as a different functional component. So this is something that we will have is we will have in the form of a hero component, right? And then all that remains is basically the card information that we will have. So we will have something along the lines of multiple cards here. And here we will have the first data that we have created in this data file. Then we will have the second data in a repetitive fashion. So that means we are just going to create a single card component, but we are going to populate our interface by using the whole conceptual idea of designing our interface using React props, right? So we're going to pass in these different objects as arguments to the functional component that we are going to be designing. And then we are going to be calling those different functional components with new argument every time, so that we can create these repetitive nature of our interface itself, right? So it's a pretty simplistic design strategy. And based on this discussion, we have identified that we need a component here. So this is 1, 2, and then 3. So in total, we need 3 components, and these 3 components are wrapped within our app component, which will be then fed to our landing page, which is going to be the index.js file, right? So that is the overall nature or the design of our interface as done with using functional components itself, right? So 3 individual components wrapped inside our application logic, which is the app component. And then the app component is then fed into our landing page for our React project, which is the index.js file, which is essentially connected to the HTML landing page, which is index.html, right? So with this in mind, we are just going to set up some files in our project directory in order to kind of mimic that behavior or to be able to work with that. So the first component that we will have here is basically the navbar component, as we discussed. So I'm just going to say navbar.js. And then the second component that we will have here is card.js in order to have the cards. And then the last component, well, it's supposed to be second component, but essentially hero.js is what we will have here, right? And then within the application, we will eventually call all of these different components here. So for now, what we are going to do is we're going to remove all of this, guys, because we don't have any of these. So I'm just going to take care of this, remove this, not save the file, at least for now, because first I want to populate some boilerplate code for each of the card components that we develop. So again, for the boilerplate, as we discussed, if you have the ES7 snippets, an extension for your React JS coding, if for those who are not familiar with, essentially what I'm referring to is this particular extension here for VS Studio Code, which is the ES7 Plus React Redux React Native snippets. Please make sure again that this is installed. This is of big help to get some coding support. So using that, I'm going to write the snippet as React functional code, functional component with export being present. Okay. So if I write that, then essentially it will just populate the whole thing for me. And then within this, we are going to put some kind of like, let's move this to a new line and let's put another component here. And then we can say something like H1. And then here we'll just put navbar essentially. Okay. So we're going to save this one. by the way. And then this is how we can populate without having to worry about what exactly we need to write in each of the functional components here. So let's move on to our Project Explorer file. So here I'm going to do the same thing for the remainder of the two of my functional components that I have. So again, React functional component with export. Okay, hit enter, and this gives you this whole thing. Yeah, if you save this, you lose the first bracket since you only have a single line. So that is kind of annoying all the time. Anyway, functional component export, hit enter, and then we have the boilerplates for all of the three different components that we have. And then now what we can do is we can come to our app.js and then kind of feed all of these three different components that we generated into the application logic, right? So we are just going to do functional component calls here, right? So in the app.js, we already have a call to navbar, and we can keep this h1 probably, we can move this one line above. And then after the navbar, we can put a call to your, what do you call it? Hero, because that is going to be the next component that I want to show. And then finally, we can have the last functional component called to card.js. And of course, we need to import all of these statements. So I'm going to say here, import functional components. Okay, so I can do import, and I have to have the same name. So navbar from navbar, and it will, VS Studio Code, given that if you have done everything with respect to creating your project directory properly, it will automatically identify it. But remember, first import, like write this down, and then just use this name, and it will understand that you are trying to refer to a file with the same name as that of this object name that you're putting here, right? If you do the other way around, it might not recognize it all the time, right? So trial and error to see how to work with that. So I'm going to do the last one, which is basically my card component. And then all of my components is ready and all of my errors are also gone. So if we go back, visit our page here, looks like everything is working absolutely fine. We see the navbar here, we see the hero, and we see the card, which is the information for all the pages. So our app setup is working absolutely perfect. So all that remains now for us to do is to plug in some contents and then apply some CSS and see how everything looks like, or how speedy the process of working with this whole thing is going to be all about, right? So the first thing that we will touch is one by one, as we have for the functional component call. So we are going to move into navbar.js, and then we are going to just edit all of this different information that we have here, and we're going to remove the boiler code, and we're going to put what we have exactly to be present here. So since it is a navbar, good Lord. Since it is a navbar, I'm going to use the navigation tag that we are familiar with, right? Because this is the nav tag that we are using. I'm going to give it a class name. Remember, it differs from HTML because class is a reserved keyword in Java. So we cannot use class attribute. So we have to use the class name attribute in itself. So I'm going to give a class name of navbar itself. And then what I'm going to do is probably put just a simple logo there for the time being. And then that will be done using the image tag. Okay, so the image tag is essentially a self-closing tag. So it's just going to close like this, as we have learned from our HTML. And the image tag requires a few things. First, what is the source of the image? So we need an src tag. Okay, in addition to the src tag, we also need an alternating text. Please remember that this is mandatory for an image, that in case your image breaks, then it should not be as such that the user doesn't understand what was there and what were you trying to describe with the image, or what were you trying to show with the image. Okay. We also need some sort of class name in order to, just in case if you want to apply some form of CSS to it. So we are going to give it a class name. You can give whatever you want as long as you're able to identify what are you doing or what are you working with. So that is something that you have to remember, right? Now for the source, we need essentially a logo. So if we go back to our images here, there should be a logo.png that I have in place here. So we need to bring this file in. to this particular file here, right? So what we need to do is the same way we imported the images to our data store is we do the import statement, and then we give some sort of an object name which will store the path of the logo itself, and then when we write the for, we are going to figure it out. Now we are inside components, and the images is one directory up and outside the components itself. So we have to do dot dot to get outside this directory so that we can access the image directory. And then in the image directory, we have the file called logo.png, right? Essentially, we save this and then we have to use this. So we will take this, and here we need to kind of replace this. Now, we are not writing a string. We are basically referring to the name of the object, and then it needs to point to the actual location where this data is, and then grab that, replace that, blah, blah, blah. What I'm trying to say is essentially we need to wrap this code within curly braces and do an object assignment here so that this will be replaced by this. And when this is accessed, it will essentially bring in the actual file itself and then render it on the web page itself, right? Alt text is basically going to be a string. So here we will write something along the lines of Airbnb clone app logo, right? So in case this image kind of breaks, then we will be able to see exactly what needed to be shown on that web page in the absence of that particular image, right? So whole idea. So here you can plug in more contents that you have learned. So you can try to do as a self exercise. I can leave some notes here that as a self exercise, put a search bar, and everything is a component here within the nav element. Okay, and separate that using CSS, using Flexbox, so that it kind of spaces itself out. You can use space between and align center. So that way you can just set up the same way we did the search bar and we did in Tailwind CSS. So you can use those components here and kind of practice as to how it is going to look. So let us look as to how. So I think it is still like using the React JS component call that we have, but we will leave this quirky feature here, kind of. So essentially, if you remember, the React JS was using this logo feature that we had, right? Where the React JS boiler template was kind of rotating this whole thing. So I think it kind of captured that essence, and we have not removed it yet. So it is doing this weird feature here. So we will leave this just for the giggles, right? This kind of looks kind of weird but fun in a way. So anyways, so we plug that in, and then the app.js has a call to this React component here. So everything is done with respect to that particular component. So the next thing that we are going to move into is basically the hero component. Okay, so the hero component, essentially what the image is there is we have this photo grid of different things that are present with respect to that particular section, right? So we're going to move into the hero component, and the design of the hero component is going to be quite simple as well. So we're going to remove the boilerplate code. We're going to put the first brackets here because we will have a multi-line code. And essentially what we need is basically a section, some images, and some explanation of what this page is about. So again, remember, hero component is basically a summary to the users from the creators as to what to expect from a particular page, what the page is all about. So any content that you put inside your hero component must reflect that information. That is what this page is all about. So you can probably say that, hey, search for stuff, and then those kind of things, or you can probably say things like, what kind of sale is happening. So whatever it is that you want to bring the viewer's attention to, that is what you would want to put in your hero component. So what I want to do is basically, first and foremost, create a section. You can choose to keep div, but try to instill the skill within yourself with respect to the semantics of HTML that we discussed. Try to use as many semantic tags as you can possibly use it, right? Otherwise, you can see that many people and many coders are still using the div tag. with different class names and stuff like that. But anyways, since we already learned about semantic HTML, try to use as much as semantical HTMLs as you can. So I'm going to use a section tag, and then I'm going to give a class name to the section tag. Okay, in order to kind of use it for CSS purposes. And what I'm going to say is that this is going to be a hero section. All right. So once that hero section is set up, I'm going to give a image. Okay, so I'm going to create an image tag, which is self-closing in nature, with an src attribute, and then an alt text, and then probably a class name to kind of identify what this is. So the image that I'm going to bring in here, I believe it is Airbnb-virtual1.png. Okay, so this is basically the image that we are going to be plugging in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import that just like I did for my logo, which became funny, so to speak. So what we are going to do is we are going to import it to an object. So you can give it any name that you want here. So I'm going to call it a photo grid because that's what this image is going to be all about. And you can see it when we get it inside our web browser. So again, the same thing, .. going to images, and then the name of the image is Airbnb-virtual one.png. Okay. All right. And now we need to get this object here. So while we are working on this, I will pose a question for you all. Can somebody tell me how to resolve this? Any ideas as to, so we cleaned up the project directory, right? But essentially we have some remnants of the previous Hello World project setup that we saw here, and it is kind of capturing this this rotating style that is happening. Can somebody tell me how essentially you can solve this problem? If any of you are following what we are doing. Any ideas? What aspect? Sorry?
I said no idea.
No idea. So let us rephrase the question. What aspect of web design? So we learned different technologies still now, right? We learned HTML, we learned CSS, we learned plain JavaScript, and now we're learning React JS. What technology can make it go like this? Is it HTML? Have we learned anything in HTML that can make it rotate? No. Then which technology can make things rotate, move around on the page?
CSS.
CSS, exactly, right? So essentially, what we didn't change yet in our entire code base is this app.css file. So in this app.css file, we will essentially probably find somewhere which is making it rotate. Okay, and since coincidentally, we use the same, I think, class name, and this app.css file is plugged in with our app.js file, it didn't inherit it, but it just applied the same CSS to this whole thing. So essentially what we can do is if we destroy this CSS file and it will compile, it will give us a warning because I think we have not saved this file yet. Yeah, so to remove this thing, then hopefully, yeah, not hopefully, but essentially this will stop this from doing, okay? So that kind of solves it, but I kind of miss that behavior to be present there. Anyways, so let's give it some alt text. So we can say here Airbnb online experiences photo grid. Okay, and then we need to give some sort of class name here, and the class name that I will be using is basically hero photo for this particular purposes, right? And now we have to give some sort of informative text. So what are we not using here? Oh, we made a typo here. We have to do an object replacement or object assignment. Otherwise, that warning will not go away. So that was a yikes that we just got before we move to forward in our code base. Okay, so now we need to give some information with respect to what this page is about, and that is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to give an H1 text, a header for our entire page, and then we are going to give some sort of paragraph that will explain what this page is all about, right? So again, it's an H1 tag and a paragraph tag. I'm not going to type it out. I'm just going to copy paste it and then just show you exactly what we are trying to do here, right? So H1 tag, it will say what the page is all about, and then probably a paragraph which kind of explains what this page is about and what these experiences are all about, right? Sometimes you will see for e-commerce website that instead of having a descriptive text for what this page is about and what to expect for this page from this page, what they do is they show you the sale events and all those kind of things, right? So if I can show you another example of how they use the hero text, give me one moment to bring that up for you. Is let's say if I find Toyota dealers near me. This is an example that I have seen being used by a lot of car dealers. Okay, so this is a very good example when it comes to working with hero cards or understanding what the hero card is all about. So this is an example of a hero page, a hero component here. You can see here that it is showing you or bringing your attention to the information that they want you to pay attention to, or they want to capture your attention, right? So this is the navbar component of the page, and then there is this banner here which kind of lists out their address, contact information, which is pretty good. They have the navigation bar here, and they have the drop-down navigation bar. We have already learned about this. A home button here, a logo here, pretty good, all good. But this part that you see here that is covered into this entire section, this is the hero component, right? This is not the main content of the web page. The content of the web page basically starts later on and shows all of these different things. And then it has different sections here. So this is the page. This exactly is the page. But when the page loads, you will see this. In some car dealer websites, I think you can go to any kind of Cadillac dealership websites, and you will see that this has like a carousel, a JavaScript-based carousel, where it shows different content there, right? So this is a very good example of the utility of hero cards, right? And this is how you need to use it for your design experiences, right? So this is the photo grid that we were talking about. And then this is the text that we added. And now I think we can safely remove this H1 tag that we have here, because the page header is going to be this particular heading that we have added to our hero card here. So going back to our project, we can probably remove this guy from the picture. Okay, and once we do it, I think everybody knows what is going to happen. And that looks good for now. Okay, and the final thing that essentially remains at this point of time is to kind of set up our card.js, right? But the card.js, we need to do it exactly in the way that we did for our project's props. We need to set it up as a functional component call tied up to the props design. So that is kind of important with respect to working or how we need to design this particular hero component, the card component that we have in this particular scenario, right? So we need to be very careful about how we kind of utilize that whole situation there, right? So when we work with this card component, I'm also going to give you some examples of what we call within React JS as conditional rendering, because we know that in JavaScript, we can essentially use if-else statements to decide when to show something on the web page and when not to show something on the web page, right? So the way we are going to tie up the conditional rendering throughout our whole card component rendering is with the content. Where is my data object? Card data. So here you see that we have these open slots, right? So how we are going to use the aspect of conditional rendering is that if there are no open slots present, then we are going to show that completely booked or unavailable, that message, right, on our card. So what we are going to do to make you understand this better is that let's say this is an online experiences, and let's say it is showing these how many open slots are there. So if this is completely booked, so we will show some sort of message here at the top of the card or wherever you want to place it by saying that fully booked, something that in some information like that, right? But that is a conditional rendering because our code has to first check whether or not this information needs to be displayed or whether it should be suppressed, right? So that is the whole idea of conditional rendering. So that is one new aspect that we will learn, and we will probably plug that in towards the very end of this coding. We will just fix everything else first before we get to that point, and then we will fix it. So let us go ahead and first take care of our last component that we have in this whole process. And then we're going to plug in the conditional rendering as well in the code. So one thing before we get to the conditional rendering, along with the, where is my card component here? So the one thing that I want you all to remember is anything within this return statement, again, is the code that will be rendered on the browser. Anything that you write outside of the return statement, that is basically JavaScript. Okay, so pay very close attention to this and maybe remember it if necessary. Only the content which is inside these return statement of a functional component is JSX. That syntax, we call it as JSX. And if you want to plug in JavaScript within that section, then you need to wrap it within curly brackets. Any piece of code that you write outside of that is going to be treated as JavaScript because we have declared these files as JS. If you declare this file as JSX, that is going to be a different story. If you declare this file as TSX for TypeScript, that is going to be a different story, right? But for this particular setup, remember, only this content is JSX. Everything else on this file is essentially going to be JavaScript, okay? So please keep that in mind because we need to remember that while we are working with this card component, because I'm going to design it in such a way that you understand what we are trying to do, you will get an idea of it, right? So I'm going to move between JavaScript code and JSX code. So if you do not understand, please raise your hands and I can explain whatever it is that is difficult to follow, okay? So again, same process, set up the return statement there and then set up a container. Let's do a div here, or you can do a section, whatever it is that you would like to achieve. Okay, so I'm going to give a div here and I'm going to give it a class name, just like we did for the other ones. And then I'm going to create this container. Now, in this container, we have a pretty straightforward setup. Just like we did for the projects, we first have to set up the information with respect to what it is that we want to render on the web page. And then we write that down one by one, right? So we know for a fact, we can check the design that we are trying to clone here. So image, rating, number of people who are reviewed. Then there is this dot operator, this star operator. These are aesthetics. These are not information because it remains static across all cards. Location, title, and then price. So exactly in this order, I'm going to set up my component such that it renders these information as they appear. Since we are doing the clone, if you're doing an original design, you have to figure out how you want to describe your contents, right? So that is up to you. So we're going to do that exact same process, that we're going to start with a container that will wrap my entire stats. So first I will have my stat container. So what I mean by that is this is my stat container. So all this information are my statistics, and this is the image. And this whole thing, if you see this card here, this is wrapped by this container here, which we call as the card container. Okay, so here I'm going to create another container and I'm going to call it essentially the stats container. So I will say a class name and I will give something like card-stats. So that is what I'm going to be specifying in that particular scenario. Okay, so what we need here in this information, we essentially need some sort of image if we want to bookmark it. So here we have this heart icon that you see here, right? So this is what I'm calling as the bookmark image, that if you want to save it, then you can use it. So I was never able to find this heart icon. Maybe some external libraries might have it. So I think I replaced that with this guy here, which is my bookmark logo that you see in other websites like Instagram and stuff like that. So essentially we have that image, right? So I'm going to copy paste this instead of typing this whole thing out. And I'm going to explain you what essentially I did with this whole scenario. Okay. So let us go ahead and place the cart stats in. All right. Some errors are there. And that is because I think I copied this div twice. Yeah, that should solve it. And then props is not defined. Yep, no problem with that. We will fix that. So let us see the content itself first, and let us understand what we have within the stats container for our cards, right? So essentially what we have within the stats container is basically this bookmark image. Okay, we are basically importing this image as we did for the other images. So let us first write down the import statement for our bookmark logo. That is kind of necessary. Okay, so saving it will still give us errors. That's fine. Let us just ignore the errors. So this image is done. Again, this image is representative of this heart symbol here. Okay, but we are using a different logo instead of the heart symbol. Then we have a span element within which we are putting this semicolon. Okay, this white space, sorry, not semicolon, and then the rating. Okay, and after the rating, we have the review count, and then this bullet point that we saw. So this bullet point is basically this small dot that is appearing here. And then after that, we essentially have the location, which is kind of wrapped within city. So you can think of or recall the card data that we generated here, and this is going to be tied up here. And then we have the title, and then we have the price, and this is the HTML symbol or the special character for the $sign. And then we have the price itself, which is coming from our card data. So here you can see the title, the price, the rating, the review count, and the location. Okay, so that is why you see here that we have props dot and then that name, because it is going to come into the props, right? So that is all that we have with respect to the setup of our card component. Now, since we are using these props here, we actually need to bring the props here. So we need to design these props as an argument. So once we plug it in, whenever we make a call to this card component, whatever data we provided as argument, that will be saved inside this object. And since we have to make sure, if we set this up in this way, that the arguments that we provide actually has key members which with the same names. Okay, so you can either choose to actually you don't either choose to do that. What you do is you set up your data storage first, and whatever name you provide here, that is the name that you're going to be using when you are setting up your functional component with props itself. So again, to remind you all, props is basically like parameters. Whenever we are going to call this functional component, we are going to pass in some data. That data will be wrapped in within this object. So this whole thing is an object. So that means it is going to look exactly like this object here. So if I wrap this around, you see whatever is wrapped within this curly brackets, this is referred to as the props object. And then the props object has all of these different key value pairs. So that means whenever I want to access to some individual values that is abstracted within the props object, then all I need to do is basically use my object name dot operator and then give the key. And then it will essentially replace the value that needs to be displayed there, right? So this is all we need with respect to the card stats. Now, the only thing that is missing from this, we have the bookmark image, the heart symbol, we have the rating, we have the review count, how many people have given the review, we have the location here, we have the title of the experience, we have the $sign, and then the price per person as exactly shown here. So only thing that remains right now is this image itself, right? So this image is the only last piece of the puzzle that is kind of missing here. So this is not a part of the stats itself. This is a part of the actual card content. So we are going to create a image element here, self-closing tag, give it an src, give it an alt text, and then give it a class name. Okay, so that's how we essentially are going to set this whole thing up. So for the class name, we are going to say card dash image. Okay, for the alt text, we can say something along the lines of Detroit murals or something along these lines, right? But essentially, when you are going to be making it more generic in nature in terms of the design, then you need to bring the card image from here, this guy, cover image, right? So instead of saying card image, what we are going to do is the source will be props dot cover image. But remember that cover image needs to be passed in as an argument to the actual function call, right? Otherwise, it will not be able to display that content, right? Just as functions work. So you have to keep in mind. So you have two options here. Well, not two options. If you're making it generic, you have only one option here. All you can do is for your source, you need to wrap this in curly braces because we are going to invoke JavaScript. We are going to do props dot cover img. So please make sure that we are using, well, I have to make sure that I'm using exactly the same name so that when I pass in this object as an argument, I'm not making any kind of mistakes. Okay. Now the alt text is going to be generic in nature as well, because you cannot make it specific. Otherwise, you will have to create another key member here for the alternative text. And then you have to pass that in as an argument as well, right? So for now, I'm just going to leave it generic. If you guys want to give it a try and make it more generic or make it more specific to the different iterations of the card component, then you can do so. So for now, I'm just going to give here as cover image of different Airbnb online experiences. Okay, so that kind of explains what we are dealing with, right? So the last thing that we are going to work with is, sorry, why does it say redundant alt attribute? Okay, we're going to come back to this and see where the error actually is. Not error, but it's a warning, but it's still annoying in nature. We're going to revisit this and see what have we done here. So we have the image tag, it closes here. We have the source, we have the alt tag, we have the class name. So why does it say that we are using on 7.7 repetitive alt tag? Somewhere I did not close something. We have to find it. Anyways, if you guys can find it, let me know as well what we're missing. So yeah, it's, of course, it's not meant to be ignored. So if you can find it, let us know, or we will revisit this and we will take care of this as to what we are doing wrong. So if we remove this, we should not remove this in the first place. Why is it behaving like this? We'll find it out. Okay, Airbnb online experiences. Okay, and it's gone. And I have no idea what made it work and what didn't make it work. So I guess the only thing that I can think of is the order in which this is written. That's the only thing that I changed, kind of moved the class name first and then the alt text second. But we're going to think about it later on as to like, why did it throw the warning in the first place? I wonder that. So anyways, coming back to our actual logic that we were trying to implement is with respect to the conditional rendering that we were talking about, right? So the conditional rendering is let's do something like this, because we will need an actual value if we have to tie the conditional rendering with respect to the open slots and stuff like that. The conditional rendering that I want to show you first, and then I will leave you to do the numerical conditional rendering, is with this. So you can see here that some of the locations that we have created is an in-person location. And then some of the locations that we have in the third data, not some, but basically the last data, I have created an online experiences, right? So what we can do is we can show either an online experience. An online experience, it will be unlimited seats, or you can set it up something like this. So we have to want to show either it is sold out or it is not sold out, or whether it is an online experience or whether it is an in-person experience, right? So those are the two conditions that we are going to capture, and then we are going to work with, right? And based on whatever that condition is, we are going to show some sort of a text on top of this card image, right? And that text will either be in the form of saying that this experience is sold out, and we can show it here at the top left corner. Center won't be the best place to design it, or we can say that this experience is purely online or fully online, or however you want to show it. So those are the different badges that I want to put it there, right? So sometimes the reason why I'm showing you this is sometimes on e-commerce website, you see these badges which comes up, which says 30% sale, right? Or sale 50% off, 30% discount, right? I hope you get what I'm trying to imply here. But you see in many card components, you have those sale options, right? So essentially how you do that is with the help of this process. And this process conceptually uses the idea of conditional rendering. So if we have to implement conditional rendering per se, we need JavaScript for that. We don't need JSX. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it here, okay? You can run it outside here, outside of the function as well. It's going to be an if-else statement, but it's mostly about the scope of where you're declaring your variable and where you're using it and stuff like that. So I know that I'm not going to be using it outside anywhere, so I'm just going to keep it inside this function itself because that's what I'm going to use. So first, let me create a variable that is going to store the text which needs to be rendered conditionally on the web browser screen, right? So I'm going to call it as badge text. Okay, so that's the text that is going to be happening. Now, what I'm going to do is first check if the open slots, if there is some non-zero value for open slots or not. If there is a 0 value for our open slots, then I'm going to display that this experience is sold out. Or if there is an online tag that is associated with the location, then I'm going to show the badge text as online. Okay, so again, to repeat, in the card data, we have this open slots. So if this open slot is a non-zero value, then I'm not going to show the fact that it is sold out. If it is a 0 value, like for example, this one, then I'm going to display a text that says sold out. If the location is online, then I'm going to display a text saying online so that our users know that it is an online experience. Now, depending on your design criteria, you can do whatever you want as long as you understand how this is being done. Okay, so it's pretty simple. I know that this conditional information is present in my data set. This data set is going to be plugged into my functional component through props, right? So I'm going to grab it from my props object and then refer to the actual key value that we are going to be using for our conditional rendering, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run an if statement, and within the if statement, the first thing that I will check is props. Whoa, mistyping, props dot, and then we're going to check open slots. Okay, so here, where is it? This one, open slots, open spots. Okay, so I'll just copy it from here to avoid typos. Okay, so what we want here is we need to first check if this open spots is 0 or not. So I'm going to use the triple equals because I just don't want to check the data value. I also want to check the data type as well. So if this is the case, then I'm going to open the if body and I'm going to set my badge text to a string value, which will say something along the lines of sold out. Okay. Otherwise, so I'm going to run an else if after that. I'm going to check the next conditional rendering aspect that I have in my data, which is this location. So if this location is online, then I would like to display a text or a badge that says online experience or fully online, whatever it is that you want to call it, right? So here, what I need to grab is props dot location, because that is the location that I want to check. This is all with respect to location, right? Location. Yeah, this is called location. And then here, we want to check if this is equal to, triple equal to the data, which is online. So we want to check it against this. So we copy this, bring it here, put it here. And then if this is true, then we are going to set the badge text to something that will show it as a pure online experience. So we will just say online. Okay, so that it is evident to the users that this is a fully online experience. So you can say fully online, you can say online, but you get the idea. This is not important. What is important is the concept behind it, right? So now, how do we display this text? And this is where the JSX syntax will come into play. And this is important. And this is the new thing that you essentially have to understand is you need to take the badge text, okay? And then you need to essentially check if the badge test or the content itself, right? So I wasn't able to fully explain it. So let me just show it to you with using the example itself. So here, the way I want to do it is badge text. So this is the syntax that I will be using. And so this is the logical AND operation. And then we are going to create the actual HTML-like element that needs to be displayed on the page if badge text actually has some sort of value. Okay, so let me write down that HTML element first, and then I will explain again as to how I did the conditional rendering in React JS. So basically what this div is going to be is composed of the badge text itself. And let us give this a class name in order to make it look more or kind of get it for our CSS if we have it. So what is happening here? Pay close attention. Curly braces indicate the fact that the code inside is JavaScript code. But you see, it's not just a pure JavaScript code. It is JavaScript code that is combined with JSX. Here we have the logical AND. We know for logical AND, if both the logic or multiple logic, all the logic needs to be true for it to execute, right? So that is the whole purpose of this logical AND. So what this conditional statement is saying is that if this variable is true, and this variable is always going to be true, right? Because this is a HTML rendering. There is no logical condition there within this second condition. So we know for a fact that the second condition, which is the code that needs to be displayed on the page, is always going to remain true. So the controlling logic of this particular sentence is this particular variable's value. So let's say this code executes. We go through lines 6 to 10, right? This checks, and let's say the open spot value is, let's say 10. So that means this if condition is false, we don't go into the body of this if loop. Then it comes and checks the location. The location is, let's say, Detroit. So that means this bash text remains false as well, right? There is no value that is assigned. So essentially, there is no content inside batch text because here, when I declared batch text, I did not assign any value to it. So essentially, this becomes undefined. So undefined and some truth value becomes undefined again. So this particular rendering of or this particular badge text that needs to be displayed as an HTML-like code on our web browser, this will not be shown. However, if we say batch text, let's say open spots is 0, and we get this value that is assigned to our variable that it is sold out. So when we come to this 13th sentence again, then this is true because there is some content here now, right? Writing it in this way is the same as saying while 1. That is always true, right? If you remember this in traditional programming, we can set our conditional evaluation using just a literal value. If a literal value is present, then while 1 is always true because, well, I don't even know how to explain that, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, right? Because we are not using any kind of operators to evaluate it against something. Like we are not using any arithmetic operators, right? Greater than, less than, greater than, equal to. Nothing of that sort is happening. Is the value present? Yes. If it's present, that evaluates to truth. So exactly that is what we are trying to do here as well. We are essentially writing this statement here, that is the value present. So, well, if these conditions are true, then the value might be present. And then this value will be replaced here. Did everybody understand this? So this is an example of React JS conditional rendering. Did you all understand this?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. All right. This is a very strong and powerful tool to kind of understand how this works. Okay. So please make a note of it somewhere, that anytime you are in a design scenario where you have to decide, should I show this information or not? And you will only show that information when something is true. That is conditional rendering. I'm going to use this conditional rendering again when we do the Uber app on your mobile systems. So I'm going to show it again. At that point of time, we are just going to do it, right, without talking too much about it, right? So please remember this, the way we have set this up. It's a beautiful kind of powerful tool to have amongst yourself. So by the way, if you wanted, you could have avoided all of these text, and then you could have done this evaluation here itself, right? If you wanted to. And this remains as such. This always remains as such, right? But it makes the code a little bit messy. So this is a much more cleaner way to kind of set this up, right? So now all our card components are done. Okay. And note here, there is one beautiful thing that happened here in line 14. I tried to write a comment, but you see the moment I tried to write a comment, it wrapped it within curly braces, right? Because this is JSX-like syntax, so it does not understand JavaScript comment. So it put it in the curly braces to identify the fact that this is a JS code. And when it comes to execute this JS code, it will see it as a JavaScript comment, and it will just ignore it and then move on, right? So if you want to write a comment inside return, then it needs to be again wrapped within the curly braces as well. All right. So the final thing that remains is to now design this app component here in order to make sure that everything is connected together. Okay. So the app component, there are two loose ends that we have to tie up. The first loose end that we have to tie up is we need to first bring in our data. Okay. So what I'm going to do is first and foremost tie up the other side of the loose end, which is the connection to the data, because from this card data.js file, which is our data store, we will feed the data to app.js. Then we will take that data and we will pass it to the functional component call of card, and then that will be sent to the card.js file. So that is basically the flow that we have here. So it goes from our data store into app.js. And then from app.js, we use the technique of props to send it to card.js. Okay, so that is the whole flow. In a full stack environment, okay, this is the front end side of it. Everything here is the front end side. In a full stack environment, this data file, we are using a file system right now, a temporary file system. This will be replaced by a call to the backend, which will be tied up with a database. So essentially, whatever happens, you are essentially focusing here. So whether the data comes from a backend, the code is going to be slightly different. It's going to be an API call, or whether the data comes from a file system that is there with your front end. Whatever happens, your focus as a front end developer is at this location here, right? So whatever we are doing is applicable across whenever you work with this kind of setup, right? So import the data. That is what we want to do. So we write an import statement. We say import data itself, okay? And then where we want to import it from, we want to import it from, we are in the root directory, and this is also in the root directory. So we will import it from // and this is it, card data.js, right? So the import statement is done. But again, we are not using it yet. We need to basically plug this in with the repetitive call of our card component. Okay, so the card component is going to return a lot of things, right? So that will make things a little bit messy. So what we want to do first, what I'm trying to say is that, let's say we are rendering 3 different card components here, right? So we need to iterate over this array that has now been imported into our app.js file and stored inside this array object, which is data. Okay, so we need to import over it, and then we need to kind of generate the structure which consists of all the arguments that is present here. Okay, so to give you an idea of what I'm trying to talk about rather than just showing it, so essentially what will happen is that we have to set up an automated way of writing this piece of code. So that means we will have this data.id, and then we will have some sort of data.title, then we will have data.stats.review, and you get the idea. This is going to continue. This is a different operator. I will explain that later. But essentially, we have to write all of this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, not 6, 7, 8, but 6.1, 6.2, 7, and 8. So that means 8 arguments need to be passed in every time this card component is called. And this needs to happen 3 times. Because right now in our data file, we just have 3 different objects within the array, right? We have 3 index of the array, right? So if I do it here, if I call this card component here one by one, it's going to be a very tedious process. So what I want to do is I want to automate the process of writing this card data. And then I'm going to store that into an object. And then I'm going to call that object. Okay. So let me show you what I mean by what I'm trying to do. And that will essentially help you understand what is going to happen in this whole code. And this will get a little bit complex here, for at least for beginners. So try to keep up. If not, there are certain things that you need to revise. And essentially what you essentially need to revise is the higher order array methods. So what I'm going to be using is, if you remember, we talked about in the JavaScript fundamentals, this higher order array method called mapping. Okay, so what map does is it takes an existing array as an input and it creates a new array as an output. Okay, based on whatever logic that I will specify within this particular brackets, or when I pass it as a function call. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this entire return statement within this map. Okay, and I'm going to generate basically the content or the function call for my card component. And then I'm going to see how it works out. All right. So the way we are going to do it is we are going to first create the map, the call to the higher order map object. Okay. So let us go ahead and work on that. So I'm just going to write it plain and simple here within function app first. And then we are going to move forward and make changes to whatever we want to do. So I'm going to create an object here, which is going to be another array, because this will be tied up to the map object, okay, or the map method. So I'm going to call in data dot. So data is an array. We know that. So we can kind of plug in the map call here. And then the map call is going to take in a callback function. Okay, so callback function, we write it as an arrow notation. So I'm going to first create an iterator that will go over each index of the array, and I will call that iterator as an item. I'm going to feed this iterator into the actual body of my callback function of the map method, which is going to execute the logic that will be present. So here, I'm going to feed this in, and I'm going to create the body of my function. And the body of my function is going to be basically a return statement, and you will see where we are going with this. Okay, and that return statement will consist of the call to the card component in JSX-like syntax, right? So here, my JSX-like syntax is this card component here. Now, I have to take the iterator, which is going to replace each of this. So I will have to take item.id, item.title, item.description, and all of these different items that we have in this particular card component. We are going to write it once. And then the map method will take care, because this map method will iterate over all the indexes that is present in this particular array, right? So we take care of that. So I'm just going to copy paste that portion here to write it one by one. Okay, so this is how it is going to be looking like. So we have the key value, which is going to be one of the names, then the image, which is going to be my cover image. Okay, so let us just call it cover image only. Otherwise, because I think if we remember correctly, we named it as cover image somewhere. Where is my cover image? Can somebody find where my cover image is? Here, right? So we named the props as cover image itself. So it will kind of expect this name here when we pass it as an argument. So we need to change this as cover image later on. So we'll come back to this. I will leave some comment here and say convert image to cover image. Okay, let me explain the code to you first. Okay, then we have the rating. The rating is basically a nested object. If you notice here, the rating, we have it as a nested object. So we have to go item.stats.rating in order to access this value here. So that is what I have done here. Item.stats.rating, same for review count, city, title, price, and then open spots. So all of this is essentially set up. Okay, so now all we have to do is we have to take this card component. So every iteration, this will be generated, right? So we need to take this card component, the whole thing here, and we need to pass that into this particular call here. So we have a return statement that is floating around here, right? So we need to come here, and this is the actual return for the function body itself. So we first create this app itself. So I can call it maybe container, because this is directly connected to my CSS that I'm working with. I will leave the navbar as such. There is nothing to do here. I will leave the hero card as such. There is nothing to do here. But then comes the portion where I actually have to create my card components. So here you would want to first create a section or a div, whatever. The reason behind it is because you would need to use Flexbox in order to arrange the cards either one after the other. If it's a web browser, if it's a mobile screen, then one after the other on a vertical direction, right? So you will need Flex somewhere to work with this. So I will say here the section, and when you wrap it in a section, it's easier to apply that Flexbox aspect. So I will say section dash experience dash list. Okay, so within this, I need to call my card component. Now, where is my card component stored? Can somebody tell me? In each iteration call, where is my card component stored right now? Anyone? Any idea? So essentially, when we run the map method on our actual data, which is generating this syntax, this whole thing is being stored inside this array object in every iteration. Okay, so that is what map is doing. So what I'm doing is basically taking that object and I'm calling that object within the JavaScript syntax that we have here. So this is cards here. I misspelled this. Okay, and that will essentially, when we call this will replace whatever content is present. And if you notice, whatever content is present is whatever is present in the return statement of the callback function parameter of my map method. Okay, so that means this will be replaced by this for each iteration. This is an iterator, so it will go over the entire array that is being fed to it. So it will replace all of this and it will put it one by one. Okay, so this way, the entirety of whatever the card has, it will return that and it will be displayed on the particular screen, right? So the only thing that is missing here is this error, which says model has no exports. And it is very true because we have imported the card data here, but we are not exporting anything from the card data file, right? So we need to go back to card data. This is card data, and we can see here that there is no export statement, and that is why the import statement kind of throws an error. So we are going to do an export default data, okay, which is basically this array that we are trying to send out. So once we save that, that takes care of it, and then everything is kind of set up here. So I think the only thing that remains to be changed here is instead of this image, we have to name this as cover image, so that this kind of maps onto the data member that we named here, which was cover image. So this is props.cover image. So any error that we get at this point of time, it will be mostly because of how we have designed this key value pair, and if there is a mismatch with the key value pair that we have here. So in terms of debugging, we will have to double check on that. So let us just check where we stand here. So everything is here, and this is my favorite cat image. But what is missing is the last thing that is missing. Now we have all the content. So the only thing that is missing here is CSS. So CSS, I'm not going to go over the CSS. I will leave that for you to kind of work on. So I'm just going to take the CSS that I already have, and I'm just going to paste it here, save it. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm getting a font from Google here, resetting all my default browser margin padding, putting some early styles to the nav bar, giving it some flex display with the logo, styling the hero component, nothing much going on here. The hero section, again, flex display all over, okay? Giving it the max width of how much I want to see the photo and stuff like that. And then the card component, some basic styles, nothing too crazy going on, just some width, some font, some margin, some position, okay? And the way I did the badging is the same way that we have done with position absolute and relative. So I set the parent component as relative position, and then whichever one which needed to be anchored, which is the card badge, was essentially set as position absolute. So we have already seen this in action as well. So this is nothing new. So as far as this is concerned, with respect to the CSS, I have not used any property which is new compared to what we have already done, right? So I will leave this up to you. If you don't understand anything, please feel free to discuss it with me and I can clarify. So once you apply the basic CSS that I have done, this is what you are going to be looking at. Okay, so this icon is not coming here. I have placed it here, so you can click it here. So if you put some JavaScript event handlers, then you can click it, unclick it. This is the batch because this is the only place where the spots are sold out. Okay, and this one is yet not given up, but this is what we have. Okay, and the whole idea, the key takeaways, the main key takeaways working with this is, first of all, React props. Please know how to set it up. Please know how to connect it. Please know how to work with it. The second thing that we learned, which was new, was conditional rendering in React JS. Okay. There was also some practice exercises that we did. And again, I can tell you this is going to be a little bit struggling, but learn this. Learn the higher order method, higher order array methods. Please revisit the JavaScript fundamentals and learn this, because you're going to see a lot of this map. And then the other one that you're going to see a lot of is basically this filter. So please learn these two things. If you are not yet strong or understanding what it does conceptually, please learn this too, because we are going to be using a lot of this going forward with the other projects or other demos that we are going to be doing way forward into our mobile systems. Okay, so learn these two. If you don't understand it, come back and look into what we did here so that you understand what is the purpose of this piece of code. Okay, how we kind of cleaned all of this code such that this kind of works. Okay. Oh, and we don't need this. Essentially, we can keep this clean. Okay, so if we remove this, then we are going to see the card data, which is going to be there. Okay, so kind of neat. You can put a search bar here as a self exercise. You can edit this, work around, add some more card elements, see how that goes. For that, you just need to add data. That's the beauty of it. But please make sure to play around with it over the weekend and then refresh the concepts of dot map and dot filter in array methods. Okay, so we will wrap up here. And in the next class, we will start the next demo. And the next demo is going to be a fun one, which is a meme generator app. Okay, and through the meme generator app, we are going to learn about the main thing that we are going to learn about is state management in React. What is the concept of state management? We are going to learn a few of React hooks. You might have heard this before. Okay, and then we are also going to look into event handlers with React JS, right? It is a little bit different from what we have learned in vanilla JS. Okay, so these are the three main concepts that we are going to learn by implementing this particular project. Okay. Anyways, all right. So see you again online on next Tuesday. And if you have any questions at this point, I will open to taking it.